Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the official launch of Papi 2024. Today, the 15th of April 2025, in this one UN greenhouse, we are very honored to launch the Papi 2024. Attending our launch today, we would like to introduce Ms. Ramla Khalidi, Resident Representative of the United Nations Development Program in Vietnam. Associate Professor Dr. Dương Trung Ý, Vice President of the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics. Ms. Renee Deschamps, Australian Deputy Ambassador to Vietnam. And Ms. Deirdre Ni Falun, Ambassador of Ireland to Vietnam. We are also very honored to welcome all participants and viewers, both offline and online, from various government agencies, Vietnam Fatherland Front, government authorities, leaders of provinces and communes who are participating in this event online and offline. We are welcoming the mass media representatives of associations, social organizations, and community organizations, international diplomatic corps, international organizations, and the team members of Papi survey. The launch day has three parts. First, we will hear the welcoming remarks. Then we'll be listening to the key findings about governance and public administration performance at the national and provincial levels and issues of greatest concern in 2024. And then we will have a session on Q&A and closing. And we are broadcasting these events on our sites in both Vietnamese and English, on Facebook and YouTube. We would also like to thank the technical team and the professional interpreters who will be contributing to the success of the event today. A big round of applause to open the official launch of Papi 2024. And to start with our agenda, we would like to invite Ms. Ramla Khalidi, Resident Representative of UNDP Vietnam, with opening remarks. Kính thưa Phó Giáo sư Tiến sĩ Dương Trung Ý, Phó Giám đốc Học viện Chính trị Quốc gia Hồ Chí Minh.
Deirdre Ni Allen, Ambassador of Ireland to Vietnam. Ms. Renee Deschamps, Chargé d'Affaires ad interim at the Australian Embassy in Vietnam. Excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished guests, friends and partners of Papi at the local government, online and here at the Green One UN House. Welcome to the launch of the 2024 results of the Papi, the Provincial Governance and Public Administration Index. We're launching the results in their 16th edition at a time of great change. Change in the country and change on the international stage. Here in Vietnam, far-reaching administrative and institutional reforms promise an era of greater government efficiency, agility, and responsiveness to changing citizen needs. This year's Papi results capture the voice of close to 19,000 citizens across the country, and they hold valuable data to inform the rollout of the rising New Era's reforms, especially at the subnational level. Internationally, the last few weeks have brought uncertainty to the global economy and international trade system. While the horizon remains uncertain, trade turbulence could have detrimental effects on Vietnam's development pathway. It could impact the well-being of vulnerable populations in sectors most dependent on exports. Papi's findings here too can help policymakers identify groups who are at greatest risk of economic shocks and to design policies to offset impacts. This morning we will explore some of the rich findings across several policy areas that will be of interest to different audiences and policy actors. So before we begin, allow me to highlight what UNDP, a steadfast partner to the Vietnamese government in inclusive and green development, sees as the most significant findings. First, we recognize the consistent progress in the performance of local governments across most dimensions measured by Papi. And at the same time, we continue to see gaps in how certain demographic groups experience governance. Women, ethnic groups, residents of rural and mountainous areas, internal migrants. These population groups consistently give lower scores to local government, suggesting that they feel less well served, less well supported. While such governance gaps are common in many countries, they underscore the urgent need and the opportunity to advance gender equality, social inclusion, and equitable access to public services through the ongoing governance reforms. There's real historic opportunity to address these gaps now. Another significant finding for UNDP is the clear relationship between access to social insurance and citizen perceptions of economic security. While in 2024 citizens felt more positive about the country and their own economic situation, those households without access to social insurance were less optimistic. They felt vulnerable. And here again we see gaps. Citizens in the informal sector, in agriculture, in private services, have lower access to social insurance than citizens working in manufacturing or in the state sector. The 2024 survey took a special look at social insurance given this year's rollout of the 2024 social insurance law. Here again, we have a real opportunity for progress to expand social protection, especially for vulnerable populations. This is particularly important at a time of increasing climate vulnerability, which takes me to my third and last key takeaway. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2024, nearly 40% of respondents nationwide reported that their homes were directly affected by at least one climate-related disaster. This is a 25% jump compared to 2021. As Typhoon Yagi tragically reminded us, climate disasters are becoming more frequent and more intense. And this has a direct impact not only on people's safety, but on people's livelihoods and on long-term economic development. The 2024 Papi findings make it clear that citizens are concerned about the environment. 65% of respondents prioritized environmental protection over economic growth. This figure rose to 75% in provinces affected by the super typhoon. I strongly believe that these findings offer an evidence-based roadmap for improving citizen-centric governance and ensuring that ongoing and upcoming institutional reforms translate into tangible benefits for all citizens. I wish to thank all those who made Papi 2024 possible, the respondents, our donors, Australia and Ireland, Papi Advisory Board members, local Vietnam Fatherland Front committees, and chapters across the country, SECODIS, and the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics. Thank you all. As UNDP, we look forward to engaging with a wide range of partners on the 2024 results and to exploring their policy implications at a time of great change and transformation. Thank you very much.
Lắng nghe. Thank you very much, Ms. Ramla Khalidi, for the opening remarks. I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Dương Trung Ý, Vice President of the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics, with his opening remarks. The floor is yours, Dr. Ý. Ms. Ramla Khalidi, President Representative, UNDP Vietnam, ambassadors, heads of diplomatic corps, embassies, leaders of the government, ministries, agencies, and provincial authorities, ladies and gentlemen. In the past decade, launching of the Provincial Governance and Public Administration Performance Index survey results by the UNDP in Vietnam has become an annual event that many people look forward to. And today, I'm very honored to represent the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics to participate in the launching of the 16th Papi Index, the 2024 survey results. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank UNDP and the organizing team of this forum for inviting me to attend this very important event. On behalf of the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics, I would like to congratulate the UNDP, the expert team, the coordination parties, practitioners, the provinces and cities across the country. Congratulations for their hard work in completion of the survey, data analysis, and reporting for 2024. And I wish you all good health, happiness, and success. And I wish that the event be a great success. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past years, the Papi Index has served as a powerful tool in support of measuring the effectiveness of governance and public service delivery at the local level, while providing evidence for policy planning, making, and monitoring of government at all levels in Vietnam. Papi results are a very useful source of information for the government to review its performance, thereby building policies and action plans to improve it. In other words, Papi has made important contributions to changing the awareness and actions of the leaders, managers, civil servants, and public employees in the political system of Vietnam towards increasingly better meeting the legitimate needs of the people, improving the people's satisfaction, and serving the country's sustainable development. These can be considered an outstanding achievement of Papi. As a strategic partner of UNDP, the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics is proud to have contributed to that success through many cooperation projects between the two agencies over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, the year 2024 marks the period of recovery and steady growth of Vietnam's economy after global fluctuations and turbulence due to the COVID-19 pandemic and world geopolitical tensions. With the strong leadership of the Communist Party of Vietnam, the proactive and flexible management of the government, the efforts of the business community, and the consensus of the entire population, Vietnam has achieved many outstanding achievements in the socio-economic fields. Economic growth reached 7.09%, a bright spot in economic growth in the region and the world. The manufacturing, service, tourism, and agricultural sectors all recorded positive results. The private economic sector continued to play a key role in driving growth, while public investment was promoted, contributing to boosting aggregate demand. The CPI was controlled as 3.63%, while exchange rates, interest rates, and the financial market were stable. Flexible monetary policy and reasonable expansionary fiscal policy helped maintain macroeconomic stability and support production and business. Foreign investment has recovered strongly, with total newly registered and additional foreign direct investment exceeding $38 billion, making Vietnam one of the 15 developing economies attracting the largest FDI in the world. Vietnam continues to confirm and affirm its position as an attractive destination for international investors, especially in the fields of high technology, digital transformation, renewable energy, and green manufacturing. trade has grown positively. Export turnover of goods reached a record of 405 billion US dollars. There have been many advances in social sectors as well. The quality of education, healthcare, and social security has been improved. The multidimensional poverty rate has decreased to about 2.93%, while the universal insurance rate has reached over 94%. The government continues to promote digital transformation in the public sector, reform administrative procedures, and improve public administration efficiency. Environmental protection is focused on, and policies to promote renewable energy, reduce greenhouse gas emission, and transition to a green economy and a circular economy are strongly implemented. Still, Vietnam's socio-economic development in 2024 has many limitations that need to be overcome. The system is still cumbersome and operates inefficiently. Growth quality is not high. Exports still depends heavily on foreign direct investment. And all of these are partly results of the management and operation of the entire political system, which is reflected through the Papi Index, a mirror reflecting the effectiveness of government operations at all levels through the lenses of the people. 2024 has passed, and 2025 has gone a quarter of the way with many difficulties, challenges, and complicated developments in the world situation. Vietnam is determined to realize its development vision still. The party and the state of Vietnam are implementing a revolution to streamline the system, building a lean, compact, lightweight political system that operates efficiently, effectively. And this system reform aims to overcome the bottleneck, which is the development institution, as pointed out by the 13th National Congress, eliminating the district level, intermediate and overlapping stages, moving towards a government that is closer to the people and serves them better. And this reform certainly will face difficulties and challenges, but it is inevitable. If Vietnam is to develop rapidly and to become a developed country of high income by 2025, as the goal is set. And therefore, as a mirror reflecting the activities of the government, I would suggest that UNDP in Vietnam to research and change, modify the content and methodology of Papi survey to suit the new context. And through our experience of collaborating with the UNDP over the past 16 years, we affirm our support and readiness to accompany and closely coordinate with UNDP and relevant agencies in renewing Papi in the coming time and continuing to work with Papi to conduct a number of in-depth studies, providing appropriate and feasible policy recommendations, and convey the Papi results to all leaders and managers at all levels, contributing to improving the operational efficiency of all levels of government. I believe that by working together, making efforts and preserving, we will make positive contributions to the development of Vietnam and bringing Vietnam into a new rising era of the nation. And finally, let me express my sincere thanks to the UNDP, the ambassadors and representatives of international organizations who have worked with us and support us in this meaningful program. And wishing you all, ladies and gentlemen, good health and success, and all the best. And may the official launch of 2024 Papi be a great success. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Associate Professor Dr. Dương Trung Ý. And next, we would like to invite Her Excellency Ms. Renee Deschamps, Australian Deputy Ambassador to Vietnam, to the stage.
Xin chào, Ms. Ramla Khalidi, Resident Representative, United Nations Development Programme in Vietnam. Associate Professor, Dr. E, Vice President of the Ho Chi Minh Academy of Politics. Ms. Deirdre Ni Alun, Irish Ambassador to Vietnam, distinguished leaders from provinces, excellencies and ambassadors, distinguished guests both here and online. A very warm good morning to you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to make a few remarks today on the occasion of the official release of the 2024 Provincial Governance and Public Administrative Performance Index. This 16th Papi edition is the collective input of more than 216,000 Vietnamese citizens over the past 16 years and has helped Papi become a trusted tool that supports evidence-based policy making, a platform for citizens to encourage provincial authorities to improve their performance, and an important accountability mechanism to support stronger institutions, better service delivery, and greater responsiveness. An independent data set of interest to many stakeholders, from government leaders to think tanks and academic institutions. Australia is proud to support this initiative with the Government of Ireland in partnership with the UNDP. Australia and Vietnam have recently celebrated 1-year anniversary of our comprehensive strategic partnership, and Papi is a fantastic example of how we are working to support Vietnam in its rising era to achieve the goal of becoming a high-income country by 2045. Improving governance will support Vietnam's ambitions for global growth that is both inclusive and sustainable. It will also enhance preparedness to manage unexpected emergency situations that arise, such as the recent Typhoon Yagi. The Vietnam government system is currently undergoing a significant restructure from the central and provincial level. And these Papi findings and recommendations this year come at the right time to inform the changes that are happening in the commune and provincial levels, and about the citizens' concerns and the needs that need addressing. We firmly believe that policy making is easier and building consensus for change is simpler when governments have robust and trusted data to make informed decisions that respond to the citizens' needs. Learning about the key findings of the 2024 survey, I'm delighted to see that there has been a significant improvement in 4 dimensions: transparency, control of corruption, environmental governance, and e-governance. These findings also show the areas where more actions can be taken, such as the public administrative procedures. I'm particularly interested, of course, in Dimension 1, the participation at local levels. This dimension has had a modest increase compared to the previous year. However, women and ethnic minorities gave significantly lower scores compared to other groups. Papi research has showed that ethnic minorities and people with disabilities face bigger challenges than others to be elected to represent their communities, and people with disabilities are the least supported. This is something that we are hoping to work with Vietnam to change. Gender and disability inclusion is a focus area for the Australian Government's development cooperation with Vietnam. We hope that the coming 2026 election in Vietnam will provide an opportunity for more women and for people with disabilities to be elected to legislative and leadership positions. Because the government reflects and represents its citizens, that is what a strong government is. We support everyone, especially women, people with disability and ethnic minorities, to exercise their rights and participate in decision-making in accordance with the 2022 law on grassroots democracy implementation. Finally, I'd like to congratulate the UNDP team, the Papi team, the international local experts who've worked together to complete this 2024 Papi survey. All of your work has assured the ongoing depth, independence, quality and accessibility of this really important data set. I wish you all good health and happiness, and thank you once again for your time. Xin cảm ơn.
Trân trọng cảm ơn bà Grenade.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bernadette. And next, we'd like to invite Her Excellency, Madame Deirdre Ni Halun, the Irish Ambassador to Vietnam, with her remarks.
Good morning. Ramla Khalidi, UNDP Resident Representative, Renee Deschamps, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Australia, Associate Professor Dr. Zung Chum-Yi, Vice President of the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honour for me to address you at today's launch. Papi 2024 really is an incredible achievement. Imagine being able to reach nearly 19,000 respondents across 61 provinces of Vietnam. It's a uniquely powerful initiative, and I doubt there are many projects to which it could fairly be compared. And what a tool this is for policymakers in Vietnam, both at provincial and at central level. As the government of Vietnam implements ambitious governance reforms, Papi allows us to gauge progress towards more effective and inclusive service delivery. But it also allows us to stay connected to people, to check in and see what is worrying families, what people are hopeful about, and what sort of differences we can observe over time between groups and regions. This launch is a great opportunity for us to come together and discuss issues critical to Vietnam's continued successful development. And there are some really eye-catching findings in this latest report. It's clear that people were heavily impacted by climate change-related weather events last year. We all remember well the devastation caused by Typhoon Yagi. As Ramla has mentioned, an incredible 39% of respondents reported their homes being directly affected by a climate-linked disaster in 2024, including droughts and floods. Though Typhoon Yagi was undoubtedly a major factor in this, things are unlikely to improve in the medium to long term. And the results underscore the need more than ever of building preparedness and resilience to climate-related weather events. This must take place alongside efforts to strengthen environmental protection, decarbonise the economy, and ensure a just green transition, a challenge for us all. On the bright side, there was a general increase last year in positivity about household and national economic situations. But it's clear that in the face of an uncertain global trading environment and continued threats from climate change, that this progress must be protected. It will be important to expand the social insurance safety net in order to safeguard the most vulnerable citizens and to ensure that all members of society benefit from Vietnam's rapid socio-economic development. It's also crucial that vulnerable groups can see themselves reflected in their representatives. Ireland welcomes Papi's focus on migrants, ethnic minorities, women, people with disabilities, and the LGBT+ community, and is delighted to support interventions to amplify the voices and to increase the participation of these groups. We're also delighted to support interventions promoting inclusive e-governance. Regional disparities in e-governance remain, and though there are modest improvements, more needs to be done. Support in this area is assisting provinces in delivering accessible e-services inclusive of all citizens. This support is in line with Resolution 57, which foresees national breakthroughs in innovation and digital transformation. There is again so much to unpack here and much more to be done to realise Papi's potential. This is not just about data and percentages, it is about partnership and working together towards a common goal to improve governance and public services in line with the needs of a rapidly changing Vietnam. I would like to warmly thank the provincial and central government authorities for their continued support and commitment to Papi. Thank you to UNDP and all of the team and its implementing partners, particularly the Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics, as well as the Embassy of Australia in Vietnam. Papi is an invaluable resource and an indispensable source of independent information on citizens' perceptions. I hope you enjoy looking at the results a little more closely, as there truly is a wealth of information. Thank you very much.
Trân trọng cảm
chính sách. Xin cảm ơn quý vị. Thank you very much. And now we are moving to the second part of the launch. We'll be listening to the Papi team members talking about the key findings about governance and public administration performance at the national and provincial levels and issues of greatest concern in 24. First of all, Ms. Đỗ Thanh Huyền, Papi research team member, will talk about governance and public administration performance in 24, progress and persistent gaps. So Ms. Đỗ Thanh Huyền is the public policy expert, one of the first people involved in building Papi survey 16 years ago. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to welcome you all to the UN One House today. This reminds me 16 years ago in a small room of UNDP at 72 Lý Thường Kiệt Street, the first modest launch was organized. And back then we received the feedbacks from only 500 respondents. And we had 20 members from the media attending this very first launch. So we are very happy and honored to welcome you to the One UN House today for the 16th Papi launch. And in this session, we'll share with you the survey results from general perspective first at the national level so that you can have a big picture. And then after this, we will be working with the provinces to conduct further in-depth studies as we've been as we've been always doing so far over the years. So for my part, I will provide you with an overall picture of Papi 2024, the progress that has been made and the gaps that need to be bridged. And so this is a snapshot about Papi, and you can see that it reflects the voices of more than 18,890 respondents over the country, throughout the country. And the 8 dimensions of Papi are quite familiar: participation at local levels, transparency in local decision making, vertical accountability towards citizen, control of corruption in the public sector, public administrative procedures, public service delivery, environmental governance, and e-governance. And you can see that the ethnicities account for almost 16% of the survey respondents. Papi 2024 give us a general picture of the country from governance to socio-economic and environmental fields. With regards to governance, 2024 was the 4th year of the 21-26 government term. And the survey was taken during the government's preparation for a major restructuring starting from November 2024. And anti-corruption campaign also accelerated, especially in real estate and banking sectors. From the socio-economic perspective, as mentioned by Dr. Phan Chung Yi, we have seen significant growth in 2024. Economic growth recorded at 7.09%, up from 5.05% in 23. Inflation was high at 3.63%. Poverty rate 1.93% and 1% point less than 23. However, from the environmental perspective, we see that heavy rain causing floods in the Red River and central coastal regions, drought and salination in Mekong Delta in April, and particularly Typhoon Yagi and its impact on 26 provinces in northern Vietnam in September. We don't want to see climate change and disasters to impact people's livelihood any worse than this. So The good thing is that we have seen improvements nearly across the board. We've seen major improvements in 4 dimensions, including transparency in local decision making, control of corruption in the public sector, environmental governance, and e-governance. We have seen slighter progress in 3 dimensions, 1, 3, and 6, participation at local level, vertical accountability, and public service delivery, while the little improvement is seen in dimension 5, public administrative procedures. So if you look at the orange line here, we see that still 5 dimensions have scored lower than the average, meaning that there is still lots of room for improvement for all these 5 dimensions, 1, 2, 3, and 7 and 8 to be brought up to higher level. And this is a map showing the citizen satisfaction with local government's performance across 6 regions in 2024 with significant disparities. The high-performing provinces mostly focus are concentrated in North Central and Central Coast, Red River Delta, and Southeastern regions. The less well-performing provinces mostly in Central Highlands, Northern Midlands, and mountainous regions. And this map suggests that enduring regional gaps between mountainous and coastal and lowland areas. So this is the big picture of the country across the 8 dimensions. And for the local participation, we see that the Central Highlands and Northern Midland and mountainous regions made up higher concentration of low-performing provinces, with North Central and Central Coast, as well as the Red River Delta provinces at the other end of the spectrum. So there are divergences, there are disparities among the provinces in terms of public administration performance, and we can delve deeper into the provinces' scores to see where you are. So when we look at the gender grouping, we see that gaps exist. There are disparities between men and women in terms of their perceptions of governance and public administration performance. And women tend to perceive the governance and public administration performance more negatively. We can see that for dimension 1, for example, participation at the local level, women are less likely to vote and they are less informed about laws. Or dimension 2, you see that women are less likely to access information about communal budget, and they are less likely to access internet or contact local officials. When it comes to ethnic minorities, the ethnic minority groups also perceive governance and public administration performance more negatively in 7 out of 8 dimensions. For example, we see large disparities in dimension 1, where the ethnic minority are less likely to be informed about laws, or dimension 8, they are less likely to access the internet. Now, migrants or permanent versus non-permanent residents. The resident status also shows the divergences in the perceptions. So we see lower score or more negative perceptions among non-permanent residents in comparison with the resident ones. So we took data from the non-permanent residents, and the largest disparities in citizen satisfaction are seen in Hanoi, Đắk Nông, Dong Nai, Ho Chi Minh City, and Long An. For example, in Đắk Nông, the score, the disparity between the non-permanent and permanent residents are very large, right? Yeah, Đắk Nông. So we see Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu and Thái Nguyên are more equal in terms of the perception by the non-permanent residents versus permanent ones. And this is the comparison of the results of all 8 dimensions in 2024 versus 2021. We see that the green ones shows improvements of more than 5% statistically significant. The orange shows stagnations, and the gray color represents regression. So for the provinces with the blue color, they have shown improvements. The orange ones are still stagnating and not have made that much improvements. And of these 8 dimensions, e-governance shows a better improvements in almost all provinces except for 8 stagnating ones. Another significantly improving dimension is the participation at the local level. However, for public service delivery, we see more negative results than positive ones. Similarly, accountability. So digging deeper into e-governance to see the reason behind improvements, we try to understand whether the e-services are more easy to access, easy to use. And we see that between 21 and 24, there has been an increase in access to internet at home and also on the mobile phone. However, the public service, I mean the use of public service on the environment doesn't show that much improvements. So this is an area where we have room for improvement. So this is an example. In terms of accessing e-service portals for administrative procedures, the ratio of users is still fairly low, and the improvement over the past 3 years is not significant. We see that the number of users remain low. Only 9% of respondents used the provincial e-service portals, and 14% used national e-service portals. And so there is a large room for improvement to reach full of online services. Digging deeper into our data, we see where the gaps are. Looking at the map on the left-hand side, you see that the percentage of respondents using internet at home varied from 53% to 96%. However, the percentage of respondents using e-service portals was very low, between 1.82 to 18.5%. And in provinces like Điện Biên, we see that the internet success was the lowest. Hanoi is the highest, of course, 96%. However, we also see a positive things that while the low province score only 1.82%, but there are still mountainous provinces that have more people using e-service portals, like in Hà Giang, Lai Châu, Bình Thuận, or Tây Ninh. When we look at the participation at local level, we see low score due to decrease of direct participation in village head elections. And there are declines in citizens invited to participate and in number of candidates available for selection. And these were headline trends in village head elections from 21 to 24. Meanwhile, the village heads play a very important role because they would be the first contact points for the citizens whenever they have any complaints or anything to reflect or to communicate with the authority, while we have this low score of participation at the low level. So, generally speaking, we see that governance performance is improving, but progress remains uneven, particularly for the 5 dimensions: participation, transparency, accountability, environmental governance, and e-governance. The performance at the dimensions still show low scores and call for targeted reforms. Ongoing local government reform offers a key opportunity to address bottlenecks, as provinces can learn from peers and adopt good practices from those they are merging with. When we look at the persistent disparities among different groups, these demand urgent attention and more inclusive governance, as stated by all the speakers in the opening session. The gaps in citizen satisfaction across regions and demographic categories highlight the need for more inclusive governance action. And it is a prime time to look at local governance performance from a regional governance perspective in order to allocate resources for poorer regions to catch up and promote more equitable development because of the disparities among the provinces. So resources might be targeted more on the more risky provinces, which are at the risk of being left behind. And also, more efforts are needed from migrant receiving provinces to ensure migrant inclusiveness in local governance and equitable access to public services. Digital transformation can be a game changer. And we hope that this is an opportunity for us to simplify the administrative procedure, reduce corruption, increase transparency, and improve the efficiency and accessibility of public services. We hope that the traditional one-stop shop mechanism will be maintained to support those who have more difficulties in accessing online services. And I'll pause here and giving the floor to Paul Schuler. Thank you very much, Mr. Nguyen. Next, Paul Schuler will talk about the areas of more concerns by the people. And Paul Schuler is a doctor from Associate Professor of Political Science from University of Arizona. Rất vinh dự.
So this is the 10th year I think I've been presenting for the Papi launch, and this is the first time we've done it outside, so this is a great change. Thanks for all the great presentations. So what I'm going to focus on for the next 15 to 20 minutes is sort of 3 issues. One is we're going to look at, from a sort of national perspective, what is the issue that citizens prioritize the most? So Nguyen just went over how Vietnam has performed across 8 different dimensions, but we're going to look at which one of these dimensions seems to be the one that's the most important for the government to deal with from the citizens' perspective. Then looking at that, as I'm going to sort of foreshadow, corruption is one of the most important issues, and so we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how Vietnam has performed in corruption and dealing with the control of corruption. Then I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about access to social insurance. And we're going to talk about that because in July of 2025, the new law on social insurance access will be implemented. And this law is meant to expand the degree to which Vietnamese citizens have access to social insurance, which actually, as we're going to show, is very important for people's perspective on the quality of the economy. So we're going to show you some interesting numbers on access to social insurance. All right, so let's dive right into it. So every year on the Papi survey since 2015, we've asked an open-ended question about what is the issue that you think the government should most address in the next year. And this year, as you can see, control of corruption was the issue that Vietnamese citizens felt was the most important for the government to address. 22.5% of people responded that this was one of their top 3 issues. Poverty and hunger reduction was the second most important issue, with 14.2% saying that was the most important issue for the government to address. Jobs and employment was third at 12.6%. So what you can see is that aside from control of corruption, consistent with what we see in a lot of other countries around the world, it's the economy that really is driving people's interests, except for corruption being still a very important issue in Vietnam. I did want to highlight that the environment also did return to the top 10 number of issues in 2024. This is the first time in a couple years that the environment has been in the top 10 of issues. But I think this graph, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it just because it might be a little bit overwhelming when you first look at it. But I think this graph kind of shows you why 2024 was a particularly special year for the control of corruption being of interest to citizens. So this is going back to 2015, the first year that we asked this open-ended question, and we're just tracking corruption, poverty and hunger, jobs and employment, the environment and health, and the percentage of citizens that responded this was one of their top issues. What you can see is a dramatic increase from 2023 to 2024 in citizens saying that the control of corruption is the most important issue for them to address. It's only ever been about 5 to 6%, the maximum of 7% of people answering that this was the most important issue in 2017. It surged 17 percentage points from 5% to 22% in 2024. Poverty and hunger has historically been the most important issue that citizens think the government should address, and that's still an important issue at 14.2%, but it's declined from above 20% where it had historically been in the last couple years. So we're going to talk a little bit more about why that might be, because this is obviously something that's sort of an anomalous finding that we haven't seen in previous years. And so we're going to probe in the next couple slides what it is that's driving this interest in corruption in 2024. So one thing that we might think is causing people to be concerned about control of corruption is that maybe corruption is actually getting worse at the local level. So maybe people are being asked to pay more bribes. Maybe people perceive that the local government is more tied to business interests. Maybe people are being forced to pay grease money for administrative procedures. But when we look at the 4 dimensions that comprise the anti-corruption or the control of corruption dimension, we actually see paradoxically improvements in each one of these sub-dimensions. So the first dimension looks at limits at corruption in local government. This basically assesses whether or not people have to pay bribes for administrative procedures. The second one looks at whether or not people have to pay bribes for public services like education or healthcare. The third looks at nepotism in state employment. Do people think that you need connections to get hired by the local government? And then the fourth looks at overall willingness to fight corruption. Do people perceive the local government as being willing to fight corruption? And what you can see is that there's improvements in control of corruption across each of these different dimensions, which is sort of at odds with what we saw in the previous slide, which suggests that people are very, very concerned about corruption. So in the report, you'll see we don't have enough time to go through it in this presentation, but in the report we surmise that it might have been some of the very salient, high-profile, grand corruption cases that were in the media in 2024 during the time that we fielded the survey that might have led this to be sort of front of mind for people that were answering the survey. And in fact, when we conducted some survey techniques, some survey experimental techniques, what we found is that when we primed people about the anti-corruption campaign, particularly in the banking sector, we found that people thought corruption was getting worse. We thought that people thought that the national government was not dealing with corruption to as great a degree as they should be. And so it really seemed that people were queuing off these national level corruption cases, even as corruption at the local level in terms of petty bribery and petty corruption seems to be declining. So this is sort of a complex picture where we really have to think about corruption along 2 different dimensions. People are perceiving petty corruption very, very differently than how they're perceiving corruption at the national level. And so that seems to be what the Papi is showing us. So I do want to return a little bit to petty corruption just for a second, because the slide that I just showed you might give you the impression that corruption is on its way to being eradicated in Vietnam at the local level. So we've shown that there's improvements, but by no means is corruption eliminated. So we still see a high prevalence of bribe payments for various administrative procedures. So one of the questions that we include is a survey experiment that tries to get at whether or not people have to pay bribes to get education services, to get healthcare, or to get land use rights certificates. And we can see is that since 2021, there's been a decline in the percentage of people saying that they had to pay bribes for teachers or pay bribes for healthcare. And so there has been real progress in some areas, but for land use rights certificates, 20% of people that said they applied for a land use rights certificate in the previous year, we estimate that about 20% of them had to pay a bribe in order to access those land use rights certificates. So this suggests that there is still the prevalence for some of these very important administrative procedures. We still see bribes. I'm only going to look at one more slide here related to corruption, but this kind of gives you a sense of the improvements, but also the area for improvement with regard to nepotism. So this is a set of questions that asks whether or not people think that connections are somewhat important or very important to gain employment at these various public service jobs. So application for working in the land registrar's office, the justice office, the commune police, the primary schools, or the People's Committee staff. Did people think it was either somewhat or very important for you to have connections in order to get hired in these sectors? And what you can see is that there's been steady improvement. There's a reduction in the degree to which people think this is important since we start at 2012 and then pick up again here at 2017. So really since 2016, we've seen a pretty steady drop. But it's still more than half of the country still says it's somewhat important or very important to have connections in order to gain access to these positions. So corruption is improving in terms of the local level corruption, but there's still a long way to go. So I'm going to skip this. We have a couple slides on the environment, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the final section of the presentation, which is going to look at economic concerns, overall satisfaction with the economy, and how that matches with access to social insurance. So I'm going to kind of combine these two things. So one thing that the Papi survey does that's unique amongst many of the other governance tools that we have in Vietnam is that it does give us a snapshot in the overall mood of the country every year. So you can think of it as kind of like Gallup or Pew for Vietnam. And one of the questions that we ask is just how well do people think their own household economic situation is, and how well do they think the Vietnamese economy is performing? So your own pocketbook versus the sort of macroeconomic environment. And what you can see is in terms of people's own pocketbook, there's been a slight increase in the number of people saying that their economic situation is good or very good compared to 2023. And this represents a sort of steady improvement or sort of stagnation since COVID. There was a slight decrease in the people saying their economic situation was poor or very poor. In terms of the macroeconomy, there's been some improvement since 2023 as well. So only 9% said the current economic situation in Vietnam was bad, compared to 13% last year. And the number of people saying the economic situation was good is 63% this year, compared to 54% last year. So there is a somewhat brightening mood. At the same time, there are some areas to be concerned. So this is a question that asks not about the mood currently, but how much you think your economic situation has changed in the last 5 years. So are you better off now than you were 5 years ago? And actually here we see a little bit more of a pessimistic picture. So obviously what you can see here is there's a dramatic shift in the overall average level that occurs around COVID. 2021, we start to see an increase in the number of people that said their economic situation is worse than it was 5 years ago, going up from an average about 14 to 15% to over 20%. And that number is pretty much held steady at about 23 to 24% in terms of people thinking their economic situations are worse. And this has been sort of the post-COVID environment that we live in. People still have not recovered from the pre-COVID levels of economic development. And we see, obviously conversely, the people saying their economic situation is better is about 50-50. So this suggests that there has been improvement in the short term, but in the long term, we're still not quite back to where we were prior to COVID. All right, so as the final part of this, this presentation, we did want to spend some time going over access to social insurance. One of the things that Papi is designed to do is to try to figure out the degree to which people are able to sort of protect their livelihoods around the country. And there is a new access to social insurance law that was passed in 2024, which is aimed to do two things. One is it's meant to try to prevent people from cashing in their current levels of social insurance in these one-time payments. And the other is it's trying to encourage people to enroll in voluntary social insurance programs by making them more attractive to citizens. And as we'll see, it's very, very important. We can see why the government's trying to do this, because people that don't have access to social insurance have a very pessimistic view of the economy and are much more nervous about their futures. But here's a graph that just shows the results from a survey question that asks, do you have any savings for your retirement? One of the things that social insurance is supposed to do is to provide a retirement fund or a pension for citizens. And so we asked, do you have any savings for your retirement in a variety of forms? One of them being, one of them being social insurance. So we can see that the plurality of respondents, 40%, 39 to 40% of respondents say they have no savings whatsoever. The largest percentage of people with savings that say they have savings through social insurance. So about 29% of the country has access to social insurance, government-provided retirement insurance. And then we have 28% of people have their money in banks, 22% in cash, and then we have some proportion of people in gold or land or other sources of assets. And so you can see that access to retirement savings is clearly something that generates a high level of economic precarity in Vietnam. Now, this gives you a sense of the degree to which this impacts people's perceptions of their current economic situations. So if we take the graph that I showed you before about whether or not people think their situations are going to get better in the future or not, so this is actually a prospective view of their economic situation. Do you think your economic situation is going to improve in 5 years or not? People without any form of savings, 20% of them say that they expect their situation to get worse. Only 42% say their situation is going to get better. For people with savings, with retirement accounts, or with some sort of funding for the future, 9% say their economic situation is likely to get worse, and 60%, almost 59 to 60%, say their economic situation is likely to get better. So having access to these kinds of savings does generate a more positive outlook in terms of their future prospects for citizens in Vietnam. So looking at the most prominent form of of savings for the future, this is a graph showing the percentage of the Papi sample that has reported that they have access to social insurance since we first asked the question in 2019. And we can see that there's been a steady improvement. So there's 21% of people in 2019 that said they had access to social insurance, and that's increased steadily about 9 percentage points to 29.4% in 2024. I should note that the majority of people that do have access to social insurance have it through their mandatory or compulsory social insurance. So if you have a formal labor contract, either with the government or with your employer, then you're required to have social insurance, and that's about 17% of respondents. About 11% of respondents have the so-called voluntary social insurance, where people don't have to have it, but they can voluntarily contribute some of their salary in order to gain it. Now, I think this is kind of an important slide because this shows you there's big disparities in terms of who has access and who's in this precarious position of not having any resources for the future. So this breaks down our Papi sample into people that work in different economic sectors. So we have agriculture, informal sectors, private services, then manufacturing, and the state sector or SOEs. And what you can see is that the manufacturing sectors and the state sectors, which are more likely to have formal contracts between employers and workers, which require compulsory insurance, we have larger numbers of those people reporting that they have social insurance. It's the people in the agriculture and in the informal sectors where there is no formal contract and therefore there's no requirement that they have access to social insurance. These are the people that have less. And this is because basically all of the people in the agricultural informal sectors that have social insurance have to voluntarily purchase it. And many of them, as we'll talk about in the report, many of them either are unaware of the social insurance program, don't know how it works, or think it's too expensive. And so this is something that the social insurance law is meant to deal with. And so we'll be interested to see after the law is put into place whether we see increases in people in agricultural and informal sectors gaining access to these social insurance programs. Now, just to give you a sense, and this is where I'll finish up the slide, or finish up the presentation, just to give you a sense of why this is important, if we go back to the first question that I presented to you about the issue that you think is the most important for the government to deal with in the future, if we divide it between people who have savings and people who don't have savings, we can see the people that don't have savings are much more likely to report that poverty and hunger reduction is an important issue that they want the government to deal with. It's the people with savings that are much more likely to say that corruption is an important issue for the government to deal with, and actually poverty and hunger reduction drops to about 11% for those people that have access to savings in the future. So this gives you a sense that this is an important issue. It colors people's perspectives on the the economic situation in Vietnam, and it's something the government's trying to address. Papi is very well positioned for the next couple of years to try to track whether or not that law is actually having the impact that it's intended to have. All right, so just some key takeaways from my presentation. So I think one of the most dramatic and striking takeaways from all of us that looked through this data, and a lot of sort of indicators, we see consistency across time. But every now and then we have some survey indicators that really pop in some sort of very dramatic directions. And in this year's survey, we have corruption emerging as clearly something that was on the minds of citizens between September and November when we took the survey. And so we tried to probe some of the reasons for that. I think we have some good answers in the report for why we think that was the case, but this is certainly one of the most important takeaways. Access to social insurance also seems to impact citizens' perceptions of economic well-being and is one of their issues of greatest concern. And we can see that there's still limited access to social insurance. And as we go through in the report, there's limited awareness or the perception that people actually can purchase it or even know how to purchase it. And so we're going to try to track whether or not the 2024 law, which is effective from July 2025, has an impact on that. And as a sort of a final point here, we should take note of sort of social insurance is important because as there is a streamlining and we see lots of people potentially becoming unemployed, this is going to be much more important to make sure that these people have access to social insurance, particularly people who might be temporary employers from the government. And so whether or not these people have access to social insurance is going to impact the degree to which they're able to land on their feet as they transition to new jobs. Thanks all for your attention, and look forward to the next presentation.
Xin chân thành cảm ơn tiến sĩ Paul.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul Schuler. Next will be a section on the perception of people on the effectiveness of the local government in responding to climate change disasters. So this is an interesting area just added to the survey. Dr. Eddie Edmund Maleski is the professor from Duke University Center for International Development, and he'll be presenting online. So please watch the clip.
Hi, I'm Eddie Maleski. I'm the director of the Duke University Center for International Development, and I've been an author and consultant on the Papi report since 2009. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to join you in Hanoi this week. I always love to be there for the Papi event, but unfortunately, I'm still back in Durham, North Carolina teaching. Today I want to do what we usually do in this space in the presentation, which is show you one of our special investigations. But in between, we usually like to do a special investigation, a special battery of questions that we use to study new and emerging issues in Vietnam. This year's special investigation is about citizens' expectations of government responses to climate-linked disasters. So in this survey, this battery of survey questions, we want to know, have citizens experienced climate disasters, and how do they evaluate how their local government and central government has responded to them? This gives us a window into a few issues that are really important in the survey. As we already previously talked about the importance of social insurance in Vietnamese people's lives, climate-related disaster is a major issue, and that causes economic hardship, leading to some people to have to draw on reserves or sometimes even social insurance to be able to help them over the hump. And one of the things, as you'll see, is in many ways climate-related disasters have increased over time, requiring both a greater safety net and a greater need for resilience and responsiveness on the part of the Vietnamese government. All right, so the first thing I want to show you is a simple graph about how have citizens in Vietnam experienced climate-related disasters over time. You're looking at two graphs. The one on the left is a simple bar graph showing the share of Papi's respondents, and actually, because it's a nationally representative survey, the share of citizens in Vietnam who've experienced some form of climate disaster, flooding, landslides, drought, salination in the calendar year. And the second graph on the right shows the distribution for 2024, the share of citizens that experienced no climate disasters, one climate disaster, two climate disasters. So few big things to keep in mind. That first, this year, almost 38.5% of citizens reported experiencing at least one climate disaster, a flood, torrential rain, and drought, which affected their livelihoods. That's a 6 percentage point jump since 2023, and a 25 percentage point jump since 2021. Now, coming to 2024, you can see that there's a large group of citizens who actually experienced more than one disaster. About 19% of experienced at least a single disaster, but there were more who experienced multiple disasters, which comes back to this question of the impact of climate change on citizens' livelihoods. Well, what are then the major issues that citizens have had to experience? Well, this is a graph that shows the different types of major climate changes that were investigated, climate change related issues that were investigated in the survey. So we see flooding, salination of rice fields, sea level rises, hailstorms, droughts, typhoons, landslides and mudslides, and then riverbank erosion. So the major ones that people experienced this year, primarily I think because of the impact of Typhoon Yagi, were the typhoons. 24% experienced typhoons. That's up 6 percentage points from 2023. And 16% experienced some sort of severe flooding that had an impact on their household or livelihoods. Once again, up since 12% in 2021. A larger number of communities experienced droughts this year, almost doubling since 2021 to 12%. So those are the major issues that we're watching. Though it's important to keep in mind that non-significant groups of people also experience some of the rarer issues, salination of their rice fields, and also landslides and mudslides. So this is a separate question that just asks people to sort of from themselves say, are these events that are occurring frequently for you? And which are the ones that you're noticing the most? So not necessarily that you experienced, but that you're just generally seeing these changes. So you can see hot weather, especially warmer days during the Lunar New Year, are really, really common. From 83% of people and 74% of people overall. Next, you see this group of heavy rain and flooding. 64% of people experience explosive rain, torrential rain, and 50% experience severe flooding. And then 42% experience droughts. Other ones are rarer, landslides and flash floods, but still a really sizable share of citizens have been affected by them. Now, just to sort of give a different image, where are citizens experiencing this? So these are just maps of Vietnam where we've mapped the incidence of hot weather and the incidence of droughts over time. And so here I want you to focus on the map gets hotter as the incident gets more, as the incident ratio gets higher. So for example, areas that are super dark red are the ones that have experienced it the most severely. And as you move to lighter colors of orange, kind of that pale orange color, those have experienced it less severely. So the extremely hot weather was experienced mostly in the north central coast and then a little bit around Hanoi and in the northern uplands. Those who had extremely warm Tets, again in the north central coast and also the northern mountainous area. And then finally, droughts. There was some sporadic cases of droughts, but you can see some a little bit in the northern uplands, some in the Red River Delta, and then also a few areas in the southeast and Mekong Delta. Moving on to heavy rain and flooding. Here the pattern is a little bit different, but you can see that it's mostly the mountainous areas and a little bit more south in the central coast where we're experiencing heavy amounts of heavy rain and flooding. All right. A serious problem that's received a lot of attention in the news has been salination of rice fields. As seawater levels rise and as salination gets into the soil, it makes it very difficult to grow crops. It's a situation that's been very important for Vietnam because it's an issue that might be related as cropland becomes difficult to farm. Farmers won't be able to make a living on that land, and it might lead to high levels of climate migration. It's an issue that is of immediate urgency for Vietnamese citizens because we're talking about perhaps 100,000 of people that might be affected by it. So you can see here that in Ben Che, the area that was greatest affected, about half of the respondents experienced salination of their rice fields in 2024. Thankfully, that's down. So basically, this sort of repeats a pattern that we've seen throughout the Mekong Delta. Relatively high numbers of people experiencing salination, but that the numbers are down over time. And that might either be because of changes in the weather, but also because of responses on the part of local officials. How has climate change affected citizen welfare? So here we ask citizens to say, like, well, okay, if you're experiencing these types of climate-related problems, how they've impacted your income overall. You can see here it's a 10-point scale. This is just a histogram of that 10-point scale. Those saying only negative, and then others saying positive, with positive meaning that They've received some positive benefit because of climate change, better weather, better able to work during periods of time. So the average score is about 5.14. 60% gave a score below that, meaning that they were concerned about the impact of climate change on their welfare. Those who expressed the most negative effects was about 16% of the population, which was just about twice that, or a little bit less than twice that of those experienced extreme optimism. The next thing we asked about was government responses. We asked people to record that on a 5-point scale or on a 4-point scale. We asked about a number of issues. What was the quality of infrastructure and how had it been impacted? Was there an early warning signal that allowed people to be able to respond quickly and maybe get out of trouble? Did transport recover quickly? Was there information going on? Was there information available about what was going on that citizens could respond to? Could they get access to utilities such as energy, lighting, water, telephone? How was the damage relief payments? And did citizens participate in actually helping each other out? You can see here that most scores are relatively medium. People were generally pleased overall. There were generally high levels of satisfaction with government responses, despite the higher amount of climate-related incidents. I think that's important to keep in mind. Even though climate-related incidents are getting worse, the government response, most people are happy with it. They're happiest overall with the fact that their fellow citizens engaged to help them and the amount of damage relief. Areas that received lower attention was that there's some questions about the strength of infrastructure, roads, dikes, and drainage systems didn't manage the storms as well as people had hoped. Early warning systems could be improved. Some people thought that there was enough time for a warning that they didn't receive. And they were disappointed with the ability of transport to recover quickly afterwards. So those are the three lowest in the areas that probably need the most work. In the second part of our investigation in this chapter, we turned to look specifically at the Yagi areas. So there were, in our study, there were about 11 provinces that were affected by Yagi. Well, actually, there were more than that, but there were a certain group that we surveyed before the Yagi storm, and then another group that we surveyed after. And that in this graph, that's that orange graph is those that were surveyed after Yagi, so we can look at the impact of Yagi, and then another group of similar provinces that were surveyed before Yagi. And so it's interesting to compare those two to see overall, like, how much did Yagi affect people's notions about climate-related events and also their livelihood. The green group was not affected by Yagi at all. So the first thing to notice is that those that said, I experienced a climate-related event, and the number of events they experienced are clearly much higher in the orange bars of those we surveyed after the Yagi storm. It's about 10 percentage points higher, and the number of incidents is about 0.06. And then when we compare those that we surveyed after to those that weren't hit at Yagi by all, keep in mind that's about a 14% gap. That 14% gap represents about 3 million people who were directly impacted by Yagi and are now reporting being impacted by climate change events. Where was the Yagi effect the highest? Well, you can see it was in the heavy rain and the flooding. Though it's interesting, places affected by Yagi did not report higher landslides or flash floods. How did that change people's views about the government response? The clearest one, and I think the one that is the most interesting overall, given what Professor Schuler presented, those that were affected by Yagi and surveyed after, the orange bar, were much more likely to say that they preferred environmental protection over economic growth. That is, they were given a question that said, what do you feel about government policy? What should the government prioritize? And overall, a majority of people in all three groups had a preference for environmental protection, but for those affected by Yagi, it was much higher. Noticeably, when we look at how they felt about the government response, there wasn't much difference. So that citizens that were directly hit by Yagi were generally as satisfied with government responses as those places that weren't. And when we asked about the impact of climate change, it's higher, but not dramatically higher than those places that didn't experience the Yagi storm at all. So the bottom line at the end of the day is that the Papi survey reveals a pretty complex relationship between climate change perceptions and disaster experience. So there is a growing awareness of climate change and its effects. A majority of citizens, particularly in the north and north central coasts, perceived an increase in hot days and warmer temperatures due to previous years. The Yagi typhoon, which was devastating, influenced citizens' perceptions and experiences. Citizens that were directly affected by the typhoon are more likely to say they prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. They experienced more negative effects, but interestingly, they don't say they experience long-term economic effects. So, and that gives us I guess, relatively positive sense that the government response was good and that the relief was enough to be able to mitigate potential effects. So, at least in our survey, we don't see that, though we might see longer-term effects past the survey. Looking at the government responses, what can be done as Vietnam thinks that these incidents might become more common in the future? Definitely there's a need to strengthen disaster preparedness. It's a multifaceted approach that goes beyond just general awareness campaigns. Resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, and community-based programs, especially where citizens come out to help each other, are necessary and should be put in place. Disaster response mechanisms need to be geared towards the responsiveness to community needs, including interagency coordination that will help citizens access information and resources. All right, so one final little bonus exercise, and I should note that this is very preliminary right now. As many of you know, the Vietnamese government has announced a merger of the provinces. And since the Papi survey is representative of the provinces and also representative at the district level, this gave us a chance to look at what will be the future impact of these mergers on governance, assuming that what we understand about the borders today is the final borders. We were just drawing on draft maps of the provincial borders. And specifically to ask, when we merge these two provinces that have very different levels of governance, which of the capitals of those provinces is the one that's probably best suited, doing the best at delivering governance and public services today? So in this graph, it's those, what you see, those color bars are the same color bars that and the same dimensions that we always present in Papi, the same 8 dimensions of the Papi survey. But and this is just a simple unweighted survey, adding up the dimensions to create an unweighted index. But instead of ranking the different provinces, we've ranked the different district capitals. So you can see there's actually more variation at the district capital level than there is at the province level. Overall scores range from about 37 to almost 49. And there are some extremely high performers. Phan Giang Thap Cham, Ha Long, Phan Thiet, and Bac Ninh are the highest performing provincial capitals. And the key issue that differentiates these district capitals is our measures of transparency and local decision making and control of the corruption in the public sector. You can see those 2 areas. Those are the ones that differentiate which of the capitals are doing the best and which ones are not. And so just this final little exercise, this is a dot graph. And what we've done is we've taken all of the proposed merged provinces, and then for each of those merged provinces, we've outlined, for example, those dots for each of the merged provinces represent the Papi score, the unweighted score for the administrative capital. So you can see in the proposed new Bac Ninh province, you can see Bac Giang and Bac Ninh. Bac Giang was the capital of Bac Giang province. Bac Ninh was the capital of Bac Ninh province. And you can see that Bac Ninh has higher governance performance than Bac Giang city. And that might make a difference when thinking about where to, as you're getting started in the merger of the provinces and trying to think about new administrative structures, where to look for examples and best practices within the province. You can see the same for the new Kanta city, between Vitang city and Sokchang versus Ningqiu district. So there's just, we just presented this graph here. I thought it might be interesting for local government officials and policymakers to think about and compare the different district capitals. So it's just something that to provide for consideration when assigning the new administrative centers. We think it makes sense to look at historical governance when thinking about how you're going to deal with the merged provinces as you're adding new demands on their time, new demands on their resources. Maybe it might make sense to focus on the places that have handled it well before, and then eventually that can pass on and best practices can spread to the other areas. You can always learn from the best performing cities within a province, and this is an opportunity to generate that type of learning. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed presenting you today. I'll be listening live on television, and I can't wait to hear your opinions and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Chương trình nghiên cứu Papi đã đi qua
Dr. Edmund Malensky. So 2024 Papi survey has gone through a challenging journey, and we have looked at different dimensions of the index. The respondents provided their responses on various aspects of the local authorities' public administration performance. This is a short clip introducing Papi 2024. Join us in watching it. We will move to the Q&A session on 2024 Papi. We would like to invite Ms. Sabina Stein, UNDP Vietnam, Dr. Trần Công Chính, Ms. Đỗ Thanh Huyền, Dr. Edmund Malensky, and Dr. Paul Schuller. Xin cảm ơn quý vị. Cảm ơn tất cả các đại biểu đã
A little bit hot, and that helped give a little bit of background to the presentation on climate change. So it's a bit of a real life experience here. But really grateful for you all to be with us today. And now we have approximately 30 minutes for some Q&A, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you, our audience, both here in the room today, but also online, to hear your reactions, to hear your questions, to hear your thoughts on the 2024 Papi, and of course, on what this means for the ambitious reforms that are being rolled out at the moment in Vietnam. So I'd like to open the floor, ladies and gentlemen. in case anyone has a starting question or comment or feedback. Thank you so much. I'll invite the ambassador of Norway to kick our conversation up. Do we have some microphones?
Thank you. Let me first of all just say thank you for producing this report again. I think it, for me, is probably the most interesting report that comes out any given year to see the state of affairs in Vietnam. It may be a little bit early in the discussion to bring up this question, but I'm very curious, how are you going to make sure that you get to sort of comparison with next year's report, given the reforms that are happening now? I imagine that we have an excellent baseline in a way in the existing material, but how can you make use of it with new provincial borders? Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks for that great question. Yeah, so obviously we sort of teased at the very end how Papi can be used to address some of the major changes that are happening. Obviously, the merger of the provinces going down to 34 provinces from 63 is the most dramatic shift. Actually, the Papi survey as currently constructed is actually very uniquely positioned to be able to assess the impact of these changes, because the Papi survey actually is a stratified clustered sample. So I'll make that a little bit simpler. So what we do is we actually, for each province, because we don't have the resources to randomly select individuals from throughout the province, we select 3 districts per province. There's some provinces where we select more, but for most provinces we select 3 districts, and then we survey some communes and then some villages within those districts. So what we can do going forward is we can see in these districts, some of which will be in new provinces, some of which will remain in the previous provinces, we can actually track how did the merger impact these people that live in provinces where they get merged into new provinces, or how do they manage where they're in provinces where they stayed in an unmerged province. And so we'll actually be able to, without really changing the structure at all, be able to use the existing Papi infrastructure to be able to track changes across all of these different dimensions. And so actually that's one of the most exciting things. This is the perfect time to have Papi structured the way that it is structured, because we'll be very uniquely positioned to be able to see sort of a difference in difference between merged provinces and non-merged provinces. And so I think some of the things, just to sort of extend on that, to look for going forward, I think are the corruption indicators, and I think the participation at local levels indicators. Because we're going to be wanting to pay attention to whether or not these merged provinces, which are going to be bigger and are going to be getting rid of district governments, are they being as responsive and as accessible to citizens as the previous structure was? They could be more efficient, but the cost of efficiency can sometimes be representation. And so it'll be interesting to see going forward whether those things remain as in these merged provinces.
Thanks so much, Paul. And we will be, as soon as this launch is over, talking to our national partners to see how we take the survey forward in this changed context. So thanks so much for that question. Any other questions or remarks, both in the room or online? Please, Ambassador Guerrier.
No, thank you. Very interesting report. I am just wondering, since you've had so many editions of this report, if you've been able to measure in any way the impact of the report on government policy at national and local level. Has it been used, and how?
Thank you very much for that very great question. Cảm ơn ông rất là nhiều vì câu hỏi thì rất là hay ạ.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Over the past 16 years, we've been working very closely with local governments in all 63 provinces and cities, and we've been monitoring and following the Papi 2024. I mean, the local authorities have been following and watching closely Papi results, first survey results in their policy making efforts and in adapting and modifying their own actions. And I had the privilege of going back regularly to the provinces to work at a deeper level, not just at the national level, as I mentioned this morning, but we have managed to work much deeper with all more than 120 indicators, pointing out to the local governments where they are doing well, where there is room for them to improve. And based on these discussions, the local governments have developed their own action plans. And in the first 10 years of the journey, we saw more clearly the tenure mindset among the provincial leaders. But now things have improved because we don't see that, slow down in their efforts towards the end of their tenure. But now we see the upward trend even at the later years of their term in office. So that's very positive. So that is the impact at the local level. At the national level, I think that, yes, there should be. For example, Papi analysis has been included in measuring Vietnam's progress in achieving SDGs over the past years, or the Monterey in the past, and MEA currently has been using Papi data in measuring the citizens' perceptions on local governance. In 2024, they launched their study results, including an assessment of Papis in the local governance impact. And I hope that you have time to read through this report, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your question. We have one question at the back. Please, sir. Could we get a microphone towards the back of the courtyard? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, team, for very interesting report and presentation. I'm particularly impressed with Paul's presentation when you present us a lot of your useful data. I have one question. I'm impressed when you talked about the issues of most concern, and for those with savings and those without savings. The one with savings are more concerned about employment than the ones without saving. So if we just look at the dimension of having or not having savings, we may ask a further question about their priorities or their concern, because why people with without saving are not concerned about employment as their top most concern.
Thanks for that question. That's a great question. So I think the key point here is that people that don't have savings aren't necessarily unemployed, right? So a lot of these people are people that are employed in precarious or vulnerable jobs. So people in informal sectors, as we showed in the previous graphs, people in informal sectors or agriculture. So they're people that are employed, but they're concerned that if something happens to them, if they get a physical disability, if they get hurt on the job for a variety of reasons, they have to take care of a family member and they won't be able to work anymore, do they have access to resources to get through that situation? And then furthermore, how do they deal with their retirement? So employment might be less of a concern for those people, in terms of having a job right now, than hunger and poverty reduction or general sort of social assistance might be for those people. So unemployment tends to be very low in Vietnam, but it's the high degree of vulnerable employment, including people that are in the informal sectors, that is a major problem. So I think that might help answer your question. But that's a very good, keen observation from the data. So thanks for that really great question.
But yes, I would also like to add a practical experience when conducting this survey. Your question is great, actually. During the interviewing process, we talked to a lot of people. The poor people living in the rural areas, they live from hand to mouth. So they don't think about future, or they cannot. So they get the job every day and they earn on a daily basis, and then they live from hand to mouth. They don't have savings. For those with savings, they usually are more concerned about future. They think more about their concern. So from what Paul said, you can see that this is a real reflection of the society and the social norms among certain groups of people. So this is a practical picture that we could capture from our interviews. Thank you for your observation.
I have one question that was here before, and then I'll come to you, Ambassador. I just had one hand raised here. Could you please introduce yourselves when you ask your question, please, so we know who's talking?
Yes, good morning. I'm Ha. I'm an expert in the environmental area. And I find a lot of interesting data from Papi survey report this year. And I have two questions. The first one, just to follow on the last question, the informal sector. I'm very highly interested in the informal sector. So my question is whether, how do you define the informal sector with regard to your survey? And second question of your results, are there assessments of the distribution of this informal sector from geographical perspective, where they are represented geographically, where are they present in different sectors? So have you gone deeper to that deep level? The second question is concerning the perception of people about their own family economic situation this year and 5 years ago. And this is a particularly interesting information. My question is whether the perceptions of the respondents about their economic situation, the intensity or the number of disasters that they have experienced, the episodes of natural disasters in 2024, do they have anything to do with that perception? Do you analyze the burden, the costs of burden that they have to carry, and the impact on their own economic situation from the natural disasters that they have experienced?
Insurance.
Yeah, so that's a great question on the informal sector. So we basically defined informal sector as anyone who doesn't have a formal labor contract. So that was how we defined it. We did not look into the geographical distribution of where they're located, but that would be an interesting topic for us to assess in the future. But we haven't looked at kind of where they're located across the country. But we will certainly do that in the future. On the perspective of the economic, on the economy based on people who have bad climate experiences, we did look to see whether or not people who were impacted by Yagi and not impacted by Yagi had different perspectives on the economy. And actually, kind of surprisingly, we didn't really find a huge difference. So I'm not quite sure exactly why that is, because you would expect that people would be more concerned about their economic situation in the places that were surveyed after Yagi. Yagi tended to have very sort of micro level impacts. It hit certain communities very, very hard, but you can go very close to those communities in the same provinces even that might not be as hit as hard. And so maybe a function that we're not hitting the sort of the communities that were the most badly affected by these climate disasters, or specifically Yagi. So we did look at that, but we didn't see too strong of an effect there.
Thank you. But we did see that nationally, around 60% of the population surveyed did think that climate change could negatively impact their households' economic well-being. So that concern is there about the fear of a negative impact on long-term economic prosperity of the household. The ambassador of Sweden, I believe, had a question, and then we will go to an online question. Can we get a microphone to the ambassador right here, sir, please?
Can you raise your hand so that we can see? Yeah.
Right.
Thank you very much. First of all, a big congratulations to all involved. I think this is incredibly important work, and what an asset this is for the Vietnamese authorities to use in their planning and the public administration at both the national and local level. Fantastic. My question, it's a twofold question. One was, what were you most surprised of in terms of the results, the most unexpected in this year's survey? And perhaps my second part of the question is, if you look in the crystal ball for Papi 2025, are there things that may pop up that we should be following already now?
The most surprising findings? You want to give us some?
You want to say?
Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Xin cảm ơn đại sứ Thụy Điển với hai câu hỏi rất quan trọng.
Nhiều.
A great question. It's very interesting. For me, a person who has been with Papi since the beginning, and it's now 16 years, the thing that surprised me the most from Papi 2024 is the trend. I mean, towards the end of the term, but now we see the steady upward trend in terms of scores, because between 2011 to 2015, and between 2016 and 2021, you will see this shape of the scores. So very good scores in second, third year, but then slow down in fourth and fifth year. However, 2024 was the fourth year of this term of the officers, and starting with a new term in 2026. But we see the improvements in the score still going upward in the fourth year of the term. So the term mindset seems to, have improved. So that surprises me the most, which is a good thing, which is positive, meaning that now the local authorities are more attentively listening to their people, and they know that they are required to respond, and they will respond. Second question, if we have a crystal ball for next year, for Papi 2025, then, the first hope is that we will still be allowed to conduct Papi 2025. Second, if that is the case, we hope to be able to capture the perceptions and the reflections of the people after the grand restructuring. Because as Eddie mentioned, we analyzed the performance of 63 capital districts of the provinces. Some are doing very well, like Bắc Ninh or Hạ Long. However, other districts, capital districts of the provinces, have been doing worse, but they may become the new capitals of the new merged provinces. So that's why we are very curious and anxious to see that moving into 2026, what would people think about the new government and the new provincial authority, right? So with the interview this year, we'll be able to collect the feedbacks from the people experiencing new public services in their locality without districts anymore. Because in Papi, we measure the district performance, and 10% of the questions are for the district level. So now, in the absence of district, 2/3 of the jobs will move down to the commune level, and 1/3 will be moved up to the provincial level. And that will certainly impact in either way on the quality or performance of public service delivery. So I hope this year, this time next year, we'll have the opportunity to sit down here again and talk about it.
Guys, I think next year will be potentially the most interesting Papi ever. Whether or not we have a crystal ball as to what the results will be. If there's any year to actually do the Papi survey, it will be next year, just because of all the changes that are happening to local governance. It's almost like an experiment about what's happening to changes, and Papi, as we talked about with the first question, is going to be able to address not just whether or not governance is improving, but specifically where there are potentially benefits of streamlining and potentially areas where there's problems. And so I think that's definitely what we're going to be looking for next year.
And just a few reflections on my end. I mean, I think this is perhaps not surprising because we see it year after year, but I was still struck by how starkly the Papi data shows these enduring divides or gaps in the experience of governance by different groups. I think it's quite striking, and we saw it in the first presentation, the stickiness of that gap on gender, on ethnicity, on whether you're a migrant, that we're still seeing these populations underserved. And I think that's a very big and important takeaway from us, and I'm just struck by how year after year we continue to see it. And we're all very much focused on the administrative reforms, rightly so, but there's another major national moment next year, which is the elections, the 2026 elections. And so I'm very interested to see what that will do to the indicator on participation, and if we will be seeing that indicator, that dimension, shifting in any way for women, shifting in any way for ethnic minorities, for populations in rural areas, if they feel that the elections are an opportunity to participate more meaningfully. Did we have an online question though? Or should we do the online because they've been waiting? And then I'll go to you, sir. Let's just listen to the colleagues online.
Vâng, chúng tôi nhận được 2 câu hỏi từ các
Two questions from the online participants. The first one is for us. Congratulations, the Papi team. I've got a question just to follow up on the Norwegian ambassador's question. How are you thinking about redesigning Papi by the new provinces? And when? Yeah, Paul.
So luckily we don't really need to redesign that much for the new provinces. There is some consideration about how we should use the rankings in the new provinces. So provinces that are being merged obviously will have challenges that other provinces won't have. So I think the changes aren't going to be so much in the structure of the survey, although we do have a lot of questions about district level governance that will need to be eliminated. So we'll have to change some of the wording. But it's really going to be in terms of how we interpret the results. I think that's going to be the demand on us to figure out how we write the report to make sure that we're not punishing provinces unfairly that maybe experience declines in their performance because they have to sort of merge with different provinces. So I actually think we're not going to change too much of the structure, I don't think, except for some of the question wording.
Vâng, có sai lệch so với lại trước đây. Another question from the 1st of July after the mergers. If two provinces have two different Papi with a great disparity between the scores, like Ho Chi Minh City and Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu, the Papi scores would be very different. Then how will you work with that? Paul, do you want to take it? Then for this question, my answer is, this is yes. One area that is already in our plan, we'll discuss with the local authorities, sharing Papi results. So if Ho Chi Minh City organizes a conference for the provinces to be merged with them, Bình Dương and Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu, then in that case, we see that Ho Chi Minh City did not have a very high score, right? The pressure on Ho Chi Minh City is different from this, the pressure on Bình Dương or Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu, and you need to be fair to Ho Chi Minh City, not to disadvantage them. So in my presentation and Eddie's presentation, what we hope is that the new, the already well-performing localities can share their experience with the others. Tàu and Bình Dương are both high performers, so they can share their experience with Ho Chi Minh City. In e-governance, for example, Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu has done a lot of efforts upgrading their e-portals to enable the old people and the people with disability to assess the performance of their portal, redesign it to make it easier to use. So these are good practices we hope can be shared with Ho Chi Minh City as the new leader of the newly merged province.
So we have around 5 minutes left, so I'll take a couple of questions from the floor, and then we can collect those and answer at the end if that's okay. So, sir, you already have a microphone. Please introduce yourself, and we look forward to your question.
Vâng, xin kính chào chủ tọa đoàn.
Thank you very much. First of all, congratulations. I'm Dr. Lương. I'm from the Ministry of Health, from the Authority for Examination and Treatment of Ministry of Health. I find the report very interesting. On page 82, there is an assessment of the quality of district hospitals, and those provinces receiving the lowest scores are from the major cities, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, and those receiving highest score are Bình Thuận and Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu. So I, as a manager of the quality of treatment examination at the hospital level throughout the country, I can tell you Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are the leaders. In terms of quality of services. While Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu and Đắk Nông, for example, are of much worse quality. So if it is read by the media or by the public, for example, they may interpret it as, hospitals in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh are worse than in Đắk Nông and Bà Rịa Vũng Tàu, and that would be unfair for the highly pressured and good quality hospitals in the major cities of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, because the patients can be maybe more demanding to them, right? And but to be fair, I think that the patients should be happier where they can receive better quality. So how would you help me to address this issue?
Great to know that the Ministry of Health is here with us and that you're looking closely at the data. I want to collect just a few more questions and then have a final round of answers. So if there are other questions, we'll give an answer in a moment, sir. Are there any other questions that we should collect before we move to closing? Oh, please, madam. We need a microphone here. Right here, please. We'll take this last question, we'll answer both, and then we'll move to closing. Thank you.
Cảm ơn. Tôi là Thoa.
Thank you. My name is Thoa. I used to be with the Ministry of Justice, and I'm part of the advisory group. I'm very happy to be here and to see that there is an interesting perspective at the social governance, which is different from the traditional public lens, right? So Papi survey is very useful for the policymakers to fix what is not yet good. So at the local level, I find it interesting that the people would come to see the village head rather than going to the commune people's council. Why don't they go to the people council at the commune level? Why they would prefer to go to the village heads? I want to understand why, because the reforms are now going on, and we need to be very clear about the role of the commune level, not to be unfair to them.
Vâng,
Thank you very much, Mr. Leung, for your question. We are very honored to receive you back here because we talked to you in a discussion in Ho Chi Minh National Academy of Politics, right? When we talk about e-service in the health sector or digital transformation in the health sector. So we had that chance to talk to you, which is beneficial. And in conducting our survey in 2024, I agree with your observation and your concern. I mean, in terms of the patient's satisfaction of hospitals that you have measured is a bit different from our methodology. Because here, with Papi, with the patient satisfaction survey, you would look at other things like the quality of facilities, whether the services are patient-friendly, and then in our assessment, we also ask questions like whether there is a petty corruption by the health workers, whether the doctors would prescribe to their favorite pharmacies, for example. So very detailed questions that we asked. And perhaps the patients provided the questions because we asked different questions from what we would think of when the assessment are from different dimensions, they may derive different results, right? So I hope that your PSI can continue so that we can integrate further dimensions or indicators into assessment in order to be able to analyze differences or similarities. But Papi measures the perceptions of the local people, of the service users. So we only convey what they said.
Brief comment to that. We do have some questions that are more on hard indicators, so like whether or not there's a fan or air conditioning or the amount of time you have to wait. But then we do have some perception-based questions which are about your overall satisfaction level. So I think what you're suggesting is that people that live in Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi or Da Nang might have worse perceptions of these sort of perception-based indicators, but maybe they should have higher levels of reporting of kind of the hard indicators. And so that's certainly something that we can look at. We can try to separate out the perception-based versus the hard indicators. And I think that's a good idea for us going for the next year of the survey.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ching, you'd like to take the second question?
Thì nó lại yếu hơn như vậy. Allow me to respond to the second question asked by Madam Thoa, a member of the National Advisory Group. Village heads. So this is the closest position to the people. And when we organize the surveys, we go from the provincial, district, commune level. However, to be able to get to reach to the people, we need village heads. Because otherwise, no one knows who the people are, the citizens are. And citizens also only know the village heads. They are not aware of the people's councils. So this is real. You know, village heads are the ones who convey the messages and information from the commune level to the people. So this is the intermediate level closest to the people, and that's why. Thank you. Vâng ạ.
Leaders, we did a question where we actually asked people whether they could name one of the members of different levels of government. And over 90% of people knew who their village leader was, but the number is much lower for people's council members or people's committee members. And so the village leaders seem to be the closest conduit. And actually during COVID, it was the village leaders that seemed to be the crucial link between government policy and villagers in terms of following the regulations. So, you know, why that is obviously a very interesting question, but the village leaders do seem to be sort of the closest point of contact for citizens and the government.
Vâng, và chính vì những lẽ đó về trong cái thời gian sắp tới khi mà chúng
For those reasons, moving forward, when the local apparatus is reorganized and restructured, I hope that more attention will be given to the village heads. I understand that their remunerations will be increased, recognizing that the village heads are important players. So I hope that this role is reinforced and strengthened, and hoping that the upcoming restructuring at the deeper, lower levels will take care of that.
National Political Academy, please. This will be the last question.
Học viện Chính trị Quốc gia. Thank you very much, the whole Papi team. Congratulations to 16 Papi results. And I don't have a question, I just have one suggestion. As a member of the National Advisory Group, and given my experience of having been with Papi for the last 12 years, I should recognize that Papi has been significantly contributing to the policy debate here in Vietnam. So in order to continue to succeed, I would like to suggest three things. First, with the mergers of the provinces, you will need to redesign the sample. We cannot take the average of the provincial samples. You have to redesign the sample, taking into account the changes in the demographic groups, populations, and the power entities. And also take into account what changes will take place in the authorities of the province and of the commune, because the majority of the powers from the district will be given to the commune rather than the provincial. So the communes will be very powerful. The authorities will change, the powers will change, and that will need to be reflected in your design of the survey sample. And third suggestions, after 15 years, the 8 dimensions are grouped into, we can see the scores distributing into 3 different groups. The higher score groups, the lower score groups. So the 2 new dimensions, the e-governance and environmental in the 3rd group. So in collecting data for scoring in the last 10 years, we don't see improvements in the scores themselves. So the scores cannot, you don't see higher, right? Seem that they are stuck, meaning that we need to redesign the indicators for them to be more reliable and for them to reflect better the current situation. For example, asking the primary school, you just cannot assess the quality of school, right? Because from 2025, the tuition will be exempted, and it needs to be an indicator. And we cannot stop just at the 10 indicators we've been using for the last 10 years. Indicators will have to be redesigned, sample will have to be redesigned, the questions will have to be distributed between provinces and communes, and also, reflecting the new changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these valuable suggestions. And indeed, at this historic juncture, there is an opportunity for innovation. And I think we will definitely work closely with all advisory board members to see what adaptations need to be introduced for Papi going forward, for it to effectively accompany this new rising era. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it's to me to thank you all for staying here with us till the end on this hot, perhaps first day of real summer in Hanoi. It's been an absolute honor and pleasure to have you all with us, also those following online, from the communes, from the different provinces, also colleagues following us from abroad. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you above all to our donors, Australia and Ireland. None of this would be possible without you. And to the whole international community for your enormous support to the work on inclusive, effective governance. A big thanks to the team that made this possible yet another year. They're also scattered across the room. Thank you to all. I think when the team was collecting the data, they did not know that these ambitious reforms were in the working, but we're excited that Papi can be a tool to hopefully inform the rollout. And for that, I really thank the Ho Chi Minh National Political Academy, our key national partner, who I hope will bring some of this data to the highest levels of policy discussion to inform both the rollout of the reforms and also to monitor the impact. So a special thank you to the Ho Chi Minh National Political Academy. It's a real honor to partner with you, and of course to all the members of the advisory board without whom we would not be here today. Thank you all, and we look forward to being together in that crystal ball in 2026. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you still have time, kính thưa quý vị, nếu như chúng ta còn chút thời gian, xin mời lên trên này chụp hình.